Good evening. You're either watching or listening to Redwood Wonk. I'm with David Frank. My name is Eric Kirk, and we are discussing national political news of the day. We're going to start with Georgia. There's a lot of election news coming out of Georgia. First of all, we're having record-breaking early voting. I believe over 500,000 votes cast so far after the second day of in-person early voting. I think there were like over 100,000 absentee ballots up until that. People are voting by mail, including Jimmy Carter, who has probably cast his the last vote he'll ever cast. He wanted to stay alive long enough to vote for Kamala Harris, obviously. So a lot going on there. We can talk, we'll talk a little bit about that, including the numbers in Fulton County, which are very high. And that is good news, of course, for Harris, but it's still too early to be predictive. We'll talk a little bit about that. But the other news coming out of Georgia is, in Fulton County as well. There have been challenges to the, what the Democrats have been referring to as voter suppression laws, and a judge has basically overruled the Republican legislature on this and overruled the local Republican election department heads who basically want to take it upon themselves to not certify until they're convinced that all of the ballots are correct. And the court ruled, no, you are not a judge. That's not your job. Your job is to certify the ballots, not determine whether or not they're valid beyond the normal processes. And then the other ruling is that there was, the legislature had passed, or no, not the legislature, I'm sorry, the state board had passed a rule saying that all of the all of the ballots had to be hand counted, and before any official report happened in terms of the machine voting. And judge said no. First of all, you don't have jurisdiction over federal elections, and that's going to be cumbersome, and it will make it real hard for the counties to meet their statutory deadlines. So a lot more to say about all of this, but Dave, I'm going to hand it over to you.
Thank you, as always, for that great setup. I think this is really a set of really interesting developments in Georgia, because what the fear was that there was heavily partisan favoritism baked into the cake when it comes to the rule set. Georgia, they've got Republicans in the governor's office and in the legislature, and then also controlling that board of elections, like you described. And what they were given the discretion at the county level to refuse to certify an outcome. And so that was very fearful that they would use – people across the country were fearful that they would use this discretion to actually hold up the reporting of vote counts in select counties, which would skew the outcome or prevent an outcome in Georgia, and then potentially even like – it would be a situation where those electoral votes in theory might not be able to be allocated because Georgia didn't certify, because the counties didn't certify. So there was a lot of what ifs and fear. Just as a reminder, back, I forgot the year now, I think 2008, Bush v. Gore, that whole case, that was like 36 days. When obviously I've got that it was not decided quickly. And, so the reality 2000, there you go. I knew that was wrong and I couldn't remember the right year. So thank you to our producer here, engineer. So the year was 2000 of Bush v. Gore. And so that was like the longest month in history where Florida was held up and the whole election was held up. So there was a lot of fear that was the case, that could happen here. And so I think what's really critical here, like you said, is that a judge has said, hey, this controversial set of rules passed by the Georgia State Election Board, in fact, that they just did not have the authority to put those rules into effect. And so basically the county Superior Court judge overturned 7 of the rules. And one of the things that is basically saying, hey, this body, their obligation, they shall certify the election. And in legalese, shall means must. so they have to certify the election.
Right.
So I thought that was a pretty interesting element of it. But the list of details. So the hand count by precinct was invalidated. This idea of a reasonable inquiry was allowed to be undertaken by election workers ahead of certification. It was not defined effectively. And also all election-related documentation created during the conduct of elections could be examined by election officials. So that was rejected too. Like there's no squishy room here for this quasi-legal body to
Right.
really interfere in the outcome of an election. And so I think that's pretty important. Also, the
One
other
of
thing
the other
go ahead.
issues, real quickly on that, is it's also they were trying to do an unfunded mandate. They would have to hire, every county would have to hire hundreds of people to do this county, and the funding for that would have to be passed by the legislature. Otherwise, they would be stretching their own budgets. And part of the ruling is that this board does not have the authority to basically force counties to pay for their silliness.
Yeah, exactly. And I was just going to comment on the other thing that you mentioned, which is that early election fever has hit Georgia, and the most recent numbers as of last night or yesterday was that it was like over 70,000 people are lined up to vote on the first day.
Yeah.
That this tended to be a little bit more Democrats than Republicans, but it's not like the last cycle where Republicans are saying don't do this, only show up on election day. There's people realize now that there's already going to be like an anticipated roller coaster effect as ballots get counted, and so as the early voting gets counted, it tends to favor marginally Democrats, but then same day voting tends they tend to catch up, right? So the exact numbers are less important than the idea that it's on, like the election is on and people are lining up at the polling places, and so it's very much unlike last year where the same day voting was favoring one party over the other. Now it looks like it's going to be a little bit less of a favoritism because everybody wants to get their vote counted.
It might be. There is probably a little bit of a balance of Democrats, even though in Republican areas it might be that there are a lot of Democrats voting. That doesn't necessarily translate into the results, as you say, because there will be the lag effect that the Republicans, because there's still a lot of Republicans, even with the Republicans, the local Republicans trying to deprogram their voters into early voting. Trump goes back and forth, and so there are people who are probably going to wait until Election Day. The other thing is that Democrats are really trying to get their people out early because one of the rules that has survived so far that came down from the election board is that it makes it a little bit harder to cast a provisional ballot on Election Day if you're sent to the wrong polling place, which has been an issue in the past. Georgia, in the early voting, can select any county they want, right? And so it's they can, or pardon me, any site in their county. And so the advantages to the Democrats here are they've got them banked. Once they voted, if their ballots aren't challenged, that's a whole other issue. But once they voted, the vote is in there. Republicans are taking a chance that they might run into these same problems that their own party passed to suppress the Democratic vote. And if they're the ones that are at the wrong precinct on Election Day, then it's going to affect them possibly disproportionately. So as some of the experts are saying, you want your votes in the bank. That's an advantage right then and there. The other thing is that it's a mark of enthusiasm. And if it turns out that these are disproportionately higher Democratic votes, and it's somewhat likely that it is because, as we'll discuss later in the show, women are much more likely to vote for Harris and the Democrats this year around by the widest margin ever. And I believe something like 55% of the voters, at least yesterday, I don't know about today, were women. So, this is a big deal. Black voters yesterday were about 30%, whereas in the election as a whole in 2020, I think they were 28%. So a slight improvement, if the numbers hold, and much better than they did in early voting. Again, and, these long lines, if they're close to the election, they're not good news for Democrats usually, because it means that people are driving by and saying, I don't have time to vote, right? If they're doing it this time, they still got a couple weeks to get it out. The early voting ends on November 1st. They have this time between this week where they aren't accepting votes. I don't know why. That was something that Republicans pushed, but and Democrats, as we know in local results, tend to wait to the last minute, right? We're procrastinators. At least progressives are. I want to really quickly also mention Alabama, just because we're discussing voter suppression, and a federal judge in this case shut down a program in which Alabama was clearing its rolls, and apparently about 600,000 legal people got taken off the rolls, and people said, well, the Republicans were saying, well, they could re-register, and the court said, no, they shouldn't have to. You need to reverse that, put them back on the rolls. This is a big deal because thanks to the redistricting that was enforced by the Supreme Court that the Republicans resisted till the end, there are a possibility, and actually maybe a probability, of 2 Democrats rather than 1 Democrat being elected out of the 7 people there. Now, again, Democrats represent about 35% of the vote, and yet only had 1 out of 7 districts. It's because this was one of the most incredible, ridiculous gerrymandering jobs that had been done. Supreme Court actually told them, no, you got to do better than that. So then they were trying to clean the rolls because maybe that 2nd district could go Republican. Not likely that it will. Anyway, so that's happening there. I don't know what the early turnout is in other states, though, but going back to Georgia, this can only be seen as good news for the Democrats. How much it is good news in terms of predicting the outcome, we don't know. Hillary Clinton got a lot of early votes out too, and in the end, it didn't win the state for her. But it's sort of like when people tell you you've got a 10-7 lead in a football game in the second quarter. Well, there's still a whole second half to have, but you'd rather have those 3 points than not.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to frame it, that these judges' rulings in both of these states, firstly, it's a good sign for Democrats, as you've described, but moreover, it's a positive sign overall for an orderly and fair election. One of the things that the judge in Alabama case mentioned is that there's a law against systematic removal of names from the voting rolls 90 days before an election. And the Republican Secretary of State, Allen, there in Alabama, launched a new voter purge program in August. Yeah. And what we've talked about this before, that efforts towards voter suppression, typically in the southeast of the U.S., have been basically like a team building exercise that actually hits hard. So it's one thing to say that there's non-citizen voters registered to vote and to claim it, but study after study after study basically indicates it's a non-problem. It's you can count in it's a 2-digit number typically in any given year that many people we're talking dozens of people max, and in some cases it was like 2 where a non-citizen even tries to register to vote.
Right.
But there's this false narrative that go hand in hand that have been incorporated into Republican talking points in many places, and that includes Alabama. So this was kicked off as a non-citizen voter investigation, but then the judge just basically says it's a patent violation of civil rights to do that. Because it's a federal election and you have federal civil rights as an American, that some state isn't going to create phantom problems to purge. And I know we just have a few minutes left here, but I think it's worth circling back to Georgia for a second, just to say that Stacey Abrams was on last night on a Daily Show, and she made it pretty clear that there's actually 3 lanes of voter suppression that there's a vigilance against. One is these voter purges of who can vote. But in reality, people want the voting rolls accurate, but it's just that we want it, everybody wants it done in a fair, systematic, and legal way. Another one is, can the people actually vote? And then the third lane was, will these counts be accurate and certified? Georgia appeared to try all 3 approaches, and this most recent ruling in Alabama was that obviously that first lane. So all these lanes are being defended in the courts by organizations that's their their priority, and so maybe we'll see a little bit more of this, but it's net a positive sign for fair and accurate elections.
Yeah. All right. Somebody, by the way, today asked me if Jimmy Carter dies before the election, does his vote count? The answer is yes, it counts. You get your vote in early. Whether you move out of the state or anything after that, that vote is counted. So Jimmy Carter, of course, had his 100th birthday a few weeks ago, and he said, I'm not looking forward to my birthday, but I am looking forward to voting for Kamala Harris. So a lot going on down there. But we are going to, we'll no doubt be discussing Georgia in the future, but we're going to move on to our next topic.
Tonight I stand before you, tested by adversity, made sensitive by hardship, a fighter by principle, and the most optimistic man in America.
I didn't make it in life because of my athletic prowess. I didn't make it because I'm a genius. I made it because I worked hard.
There are known knowns. There are things we know. We also know there are known unknowns. But there are also unknown unknowns. The ones we don't know. It is the latter category that tend to be the difficult ones.
When I hear your new ideas, I'm reminded of that ad. Where's the beef? Yeah.
And the client asks you a question. How do you guys get comfortable? It's a question. So, what was your answer?
Mr. Chairman,
did you tell him?
Sure, Mr. Chairman, I'm just trying to understand.
No, I think you understand it. I don't think you want.
Okay, about 6 months ago, we probably wouldn't have thought of this as a battleground in terms of the Senate, but Texas, the polls have gotten close. The worst polls, of course, we have Mr. Allred, the Democrat, former football player, really popular member in Congress, taking on Ted Cruz, and they had their one and only debate the other night. It was very contentious, and a lot of interesting things to say about it. But the first clip I managed to see, just to tell you, there have been actually at least one poll with Allred ahead by 1 point, but most of them had Cruz ahead, but most of them within the margin of error. I think the worst one since the summer was 8 points of Cruz being ahead. But this is a possibility. Cruz has a number of vulnerabilities. His trip to Cancun during the big storm. And the fact that he actually has bad blood with Trump that sometimes the Democrats like to exploit. And in the portion that I saw, Allred was pushing him on the issue of January 6th and basically talked about his experiences on January 6th, reminding everybody that this was a big deal, and then said that Cruz was hiding in the utilities closet. Cruz shook his head during that time, and Allred said, and I want him to do whatever he has to survive. I didn't want him hurt, but anyway, I mean, there was this, and then Allred really put Cruz on the defensive in terms of abortion. This is the Achilles heel of Republicans all over the country right now, and especially in Texas, where you've had some pretty horrible things happen because of the draconian policies there. And so he had those weaknesses. He distanced himself from Harris. Cruz embraced Trump. This is Texas. But Allred really pressed Cruz on the border. He actually took that and made it his own issue by pushing Cruz on the fact that that he was part of the party that blocked that bill from happening when Cruz actually wrote part of it. And Cruz didn't really address that head on. So the consensus is that Allred probably had the advantage out of it. Will it make a big difference? I mean, Mondale won that first debate in 1984, hands down. Reagan even showed signs of dementia and the rest, but it didn't help him. I mean, it moved the polls a little bit, but then Reagan got that second poll where he talked about his opponent's youth and inexperience and won, and it hands out. But Cruz doesn't have another chance to make this up. So will it move the needle at all? It won't take much to hand it to Allred. It really won't.
Yeah, I thought this was a really interesting debate. I know that you and I have followed this as a potential surprise state between Texas and Florida, which is ironic because, over the years leading up to this election, both of those states were so hardcore conservative, right-wing, Trump supporting, DeSantis and Abbott as governors were just pushing issue after issue. It seemed like those two states couldn't possibly be competitive, but how things have changed. And part of that, I think, is attributable to what you've described as the Dobbs effect, and I think accurately so. But this debate was more than that. Actually, it's pretty clear that Ted Cruz chafes people in the wrong way just as a personality, and Allred's taking advantage of that on the sort of the visceral or ephemeral level. But more importantly, at the policy level, Allred really pushed back. Ted Cruz is somewhat of a bully, and he's very skilled orator and debater. And his strategy was to do a full court press. People called it his recitation of greatest hits, but Allred really stood his ground, pushed back. And Ted Cruz did not tack to the middle. He did not try to moderate his image at all. He was, going hardcore towards the base as hard as he could. He tied himself strongly to Trump. He was definitely trying to inspire hardliners and get out the vote. But Allred was really able to turn after turn. We could talk about some of the specifics. But because I mentioned the Dobbs effect, I think abortion, that was the very first topic. So this debate got heated right out of the gate. And he really just said, hey, if you're pro-life, you need to be pro-women's lives. You need to be pro-reproductive rights. And he framed it that way. And I think, that lane pretty much worked for him, so much so that, there was some polling after the debate, the immediate response surveys that they do of 20,000 people. So not a small amount. And people, this was according to WFAA, the channel that actually sponsored the debate in Dallas, the Dallas news coverage. And they said that it was about 60-30, saying that Allred won the debate. Those are pretty big numbers. Now, granted, we don't know who the population, who that actually was from, as an observer. We don't really know. It could just be a one-off. But on issue after issue, Allred really was aggressive and he took the high ground. I'll just say this one last thing here on this issue. Cruz, on the other hand, was contrasted with Allred. He was very technical. He was asking he was taking a part of a bill and then sort of elevating it. So for the example of that was the transgender issues. There was a civil rights bill that Allred supported, and Cruz was taking the implications of that bill and saying, how come you won't answer why you agree with boys in girls sports or boys in girls bathrooms? Right. And really Allred was look, this is a civil rights bill. This was saying that all people have rights, and it's what you're doing is a distraction. He even said it's indefensible to deny women care. And so that really Cruz said, Cruz, you're throwing a Hail Mary here when in reality, people understand, people get it, that this is an important issue to be a protector of all Texans.
Yeah, I mean, Allred did sort of tack to the center in terms of the sports trans particularly trans women in sports, and it is Texas. What does he believe personally? But he took the position that, where it provides unfair advantages, that it needs to be looked at. The poll you're referring to actually they were making the opportunity for 40,000 viewers on it. We don't know how randomly that selection was done on WFAA, but of them, more than 25,000 of them voted, and 67% of them said that Allred won. 33 said Cruz won the debate. So, again, we don't know how sufficiently representative that sample is, but it is what we have to go on. I haven't seen any other polling after that. The Republicans always like to reference the online polling when a newspaper says, so who do you think won? And so you get to click it, but there's no control as to who participates. And the term "freep that poll" is a reference to Free Republic. They always publish Free Republic is a very large conservative website with a huge membership, and they always say, go freep this poll. The term came from Free Republic. So when you're doing that to a poll, if you're trying to get a lot of people to go participate in a non-scientific poll, when Trump was saying, I won 80-20, he was talking about those polls and the conservatives getting people out there. But anybody who understands the system at all will take a look at it, and right on the polls, there's always the disclaimer: this is not scientific; it's for entertainment purposes only. And so that's why Trump was trying to argue that he actually won that debate. Now it was certainly not as one-sided in terms of the results as the Harris-Trump debate was, where she basically woman-handled him. But it was enough that Joaquin Castro, who's a notable political figure in Texas, said that went onto social media to say that Allred delivered a strong performance tonight, and went on to describe that as a win. Like I said, it was Cruz is pretty good at debating, so he was able to hold his own, but Allred was particularly aggressive, and it was contentious, and we will just have to see how that plays out in Texas in the long run.
Yeah, definitely. I think something that you mentioned earlier on too about this debate was that there was at least I think I recall you mentioning it now, but the coverage, the surrogates came out afterwards to kind of speak to how the performance went. And so, I'll be brief about the Cruz surrogate. The Cruz surrogate came out and said that they thought it was a no-brainer, that Allred didn't defend his record at all, about, that on the issues, Texans, it's pretty clear. Texans want clarity on transgender issues, on natural gas exports, on a secure border, on the electric vehicle mandate, drag shows in the military, boys and girls sports. So that was basically Cruz surrogate saying we won because Cruz said what we wanted him to say on all these issues. But it seemed to me that that was just one individual versus the surrogates in the spin room for Congress member Allred, that this was a Republican, GOP Judge Whitley, former national president of the county government's officers. And there were also other surrogates in there. One was a OBGYN doctor. And they were saying, like, look, we believe that the system needs to be balanced, and that two parties should work together to solve problems. They keep each other honest, but that that Allred is the right person at the right time for Texas. This is Republicans trying to give Allred some cover, saying, like, look, we're lifelong Republicans. We've run our counties and our communities across this state for our whole lives. but look at what you're dealing with now with Trump, with Cruz. These January 6th attacks, Cruz is the person, one of the people who was, an ally of Trump, and he's not distanced himself. And so this is, we can learn from history. That was one of the big points, was like, this guy hasn't changed. Why would we let him back in there? But another key element was that they're talking about healthcare, women's healthcare in Texas. That OBGYN specialist, she said, hey, doctors are afraid of going to jail. People are leaving the medical practice in the face of these drastic attacks on freedom, liberty, and bodily integrity. So even though only about a third of people put abortion in their top issues for elections, we'll talk more about that at another time, but it's still important. It's still important when you can make the obvious case that what the path that the state of Texas is on, that Cruz and Trump are allied in favor of that change. And it's just that they were really trying to make the case that, look, we need to do something. Desperate times call for desperate measures. Republicans may need to support Allred here, which I thought was pretty effective.
Very good. I decided to go to 538 to check the polling itself and how close it is. And it's actually a little closer than I thought. I was looking for the 8-point. That must have been way back in August, because I'm going back to the beginning of September, and the earliest one is September 4 to 9, CWS research commissioned by Texas Gun Rights, which is a Republican outfit. But just because it's commissioned by one party or the other doesn't necessarily mean it's biased or inaccurate. But that had Cruz ahead by 6 points. And then the following couple of weeks, Morning Consult, maybe not a gold star poll, but certainly a B poll, had Allred up by 1 point. Now, where I would take comfort if I was Cruz is Marist College. Marist College is really a good poll. It seems to be one of the few that has, at least in some of the races, adopted have worked in the Dobbs effect, or possibly others. For instance, the polling average for Fetterman versus Oz as of November of 2022 had Oz ahead by 2 points. There were polls that had him ahead by 5. Marist was of Marist College, of all of those polls, seemed to be an outlier. It had Fetterman up by 6 points. Fetterman ended up winning by 5 points. So they did really well in that one. But they seem to be more favoring Cruz than most of the other pollsters under 538. There are a lot of 1 point, 2 point, 4 points, but even the 5 point of likely voters, even the 5 point is within the margin of error. If you have a 3 point margin of error, that's, if it's all in favor, you could subtract 3 points and add 3 points, and it becomes a reverse. But that's statistically unlikely. The more you have, the fewer chances there are for that. The point is, though, is that Allred is in striking distance. We haven't even talked about the suppression in Texas, which is one of the worst in the country. And, they are literally intimidating people, and people get out the vote people. They're actually suing get out the vote people. So the Republicans in Texas definitely do not want a high Democratic turnout, and they're doing what they can on that. But we'll see, that sometimes emboldens voters. Then they show up in even record numbers. They don't start their early in-person voting until next week. We'll see how that plays out, and see if it's similar to the large turnouts in Georgia and Michigan. And then they also record what areas those votes are being counted in. So.
Also of interest in Texas, real quick, in our final seconds, the Times Siena poll is a little bit different than some of the others, but it shows that there's 7, depending on which poll we're talking about, which release, between 5, 7, 8% of undecideds in Texas, which is a pretty high number. And knowing that when you factor in the margin of error, when you factor in the fact that it's 4% and shrinking, the difference between the two. And also that there's a set of people that the New York Times captures which are probable as opposed to undecided, being a very big number for young people and people of color. So now we end up having, that Allred really is like legit in striking distance. So it's going to be really interesting to see how this plays out.
Our final segment, will white women save Harris? And let me explain that. There's been a lot of talk about how Harris has lost support, particularly of black men, but of Jewish voters and Latino voters, and there are a lot of reasons discussed about that, and we're not going to discuss that this time around. We'll probably pick that up within the next couple of weeks. But and there's a question as to whether or not that's actually happening. There was a poll that just came out that showed 87% black support for Harris and 12% for Trump. That's not far away from the usual, but there are other polls that indicate the margin is bigger. And so the question is how big? What if the traditional Democratic constituencies are not voting for Harris or not supporting her in the polls? Why are the polls as close as they are? Why isn't Trump running away with it? Well, we also have the largest gender gap in history from all of the polls, and to be clear, there's there is a poll. Maybe this is an outlier, but Mitt Romney won white women by 9 points in 2012. Trump won by 6 and 7 points in 2016 and 2020. Well, according to an analysis put out by I think it's Harry Enton, a pollster, right now white women are supporting Trump by 1 percentage point. That would be the closest ever if that plays out. Of course, we can talk about all the reasons why this may or may not be true. We'll see what other polls say, but that would be a phenomenal benefit to Harris if that is true. And you really can't, if you go into all the reasons, you got to say Dobbs. She is also doing better with black women and with Latino women. This is a gender divide race, which means if you and I are voting for Harris, we're outliers. I mean, because of our particular demographics, we're in the worst demographics for Harris. But any woman we know who is white in our lives, they may be demographics of voting may be turned on its head this election. Whether or not it's a long-term thing, we'll know. Now, I've been reading stories about the demise of the Democratic stronghold on black voters since Reagan. When Reagan got 15% of the vote, that was seen. Oh, it's going to be a trend in the future. It wasn't, it hasn't been, and we'll see what actually happens. But there is some really interesting analysis out there about how men in general, and especially black men, appreciate the fact that Trump is basically untouchable. And it plays into what one African American on PBS show I'm forgetting his name, described as the support for his hyper masculinity, and that seems to be a identity factor for men in general, and especially working class men. For the first time in years, though, college educated people are actually leaning Democrat. Wasn't always that way, but working class white women are also making a switch over again. Trump has the majority, but not by the same levels as before. Dobbs and the laws that are being passed in these states and the impact on it, 27% of women in the study say that abortion is their number one priority, and another 60% say it's within their top 5 priorities. Of course, that could include pro-life people who feel like abortion is murder. So, it's not necessarily support, but this is the focus of women, more so apparently than men. Dave?
Yeah, thanks for that exhaustive setup. There was a lot there to digest, but I think that just to kind of take a half step back, it's interesting that like you pointed out, the downward trend of white women supporting Republican presidential candidates it's now reached the lowest this century, basically, with Trump's advantage among white women as of the most recent polling here is just at 1 point. Now, granted, that's one data point. We can't dwell on it, but we're talking about just 10 years ago or so, it was closer to 10-point spread.
Yeah.
And so that's like the big picture. But I think you look at it, it's like, why does that matter? Well, what percentage of the electorate do white women represent? And so, nationwide, because of the proportion, like me and you, it's a generalization, and it's more important to talk about specific policies in specific states, of course. But generally speaking, white women are 36% of the electorate, compared to, people, like you said, people talk about, hey, black men are kind of breaking, 5% of black men are breaking away from the Democratic Party. Well, 5% of what? That's 5% of 15% of the country.
Right.
But when there's a divide, when there's a 26-point gender gap, and white women make up 36% of the country, it's just a bigger number all around. So these marginal differences really matter in the demographic sense because of this. And you mentioned that abortion being such a high percentage of women voters who say it's either their top priority or like a top 3 priority. I was able to look at some of these Times Siena crosstabs because they do a really good job of kind of breaking it out. And it's like there are very few fields that are actually outliers. But reproductive rights is one of them. Nearly 70% of Democrats say that's like their priority. That's like the highest number of all the issues for Democrats. It just as vivid as immigration is for Republicans. It's comparable to that. So if you imagine everything that you've heard Republicans say when they're blaming immigrants for certain things, or they're blaming Biden's immigration policy for certain things that it might not be related to, they are hammering home on that. And it's effective. And so that's the same thing with reproductive rights with Democrats. And then when you move it over to women, it's not as vivid of an overall hot button issue, but it's still right up there as, in the top handful of issues. So generally speaking, people talk about how inflation, healthcare, and housing, that's the core issues for people. That's really important for most people. But in this important demographic that matters, which is how we started this off, right? Will white women be the determinative factor for Harris's victory? and or her outcome rather, and it's pretty clear that that's what it's going to be. Just on the numbers here, and again, you predicted this a very long time ago that the demise of Roe v. Wade as a national right would really be front and center. Well, I think this is the issue that we're starting to see. And my last point on this is when you look at Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, 80% of the electorate is white. So instead of everything we just talked about was national, but when you focus on battleground states, and in particular, these core states that are the blue wall states, it's pretty obvious that how important this is going to be for Harris.
No, definitely. And again, we've talked about the Dobbs effect. So, how are these polls going to be skewed? I know I've said this over and over again, but I'm going to say it one more time. Every single special election since Dobbs went down, the Democrats have outperformed the polls. They haven't won every single special election, but they've done better than in the polls. In a couple of cases, sometimes by as much as 10%, but usually by about 4 or 5%. Now, we also have the Trump effect, which is that there are a lot of Trump voters that do not want to participate in polls disproportionately. And so the pollsters have tried to weigh that in, statistically. They had marginal success in 2020. Will they have that same kind of success in 2024? We don't know what these polls are telling us. They could all be off. I mean, and you've got movement going in different direction. You've got a Quinnipiac poll that is showing that Trump has a 7-point lead in Georgia, but that is a way outlier. And the same pollster, Quinnipiac, has Harris ahead by 3 points in North Carolina. That's a 10-point difference between Georgia and North Carolina. Now, I do think there are factors that are more in Harris's favor in North Carolina, certain dynamics around the hurricane relief, that there is a horrible Republican gubernatorial candidate that Trump has supported, and a few other factors of the changing demographics. But that's a big difference. So is QPAC, and by the way, going back to Fetterman in 2022, QPAC was one of those pollsters that had Oz winning by 2 points. It's a strange one, and yet they're considered a gold star poll, at least prior to that, but they may be having difficulties. No other poll has anybody ahead. Most of the other polls have Trump ahead in Georgia by 1 or 2 points, with an occasional one having him even or Harris. It's really close in all of the others. So the reason I bring this up is we don't know if these polls are skewed in one way or another. This is a very confusing election. We'll find out afterwards how accurate they were, but it may be, if they're so far off from each other, it may be that whoever's accurate, it was just a matter of luck more than skill. We just don't know. But it does seem very clear is that there has been a clear drift of women in general towards Harris, and a drift of men in general towards Trump. And this will be the biggest, potentially the biggest gender divide we've ever had in this country.
So just because you brought it up, and I think it's important context for people, Nate Silver's most recent Silver Bulletin that came out in the last few days, or maybe 2 times ago, they're coming out a little bit more frequently, so but very recent. It was asking about the models, and it was asking about flooding the models with partisan surveys. And is it a Republican strategy to have internal polling or purchased polls basically have the tail wag the dog? They get really into the weeds on it, and they assess the underlying similarities and differences between which polls get included in these models and how they get weighted based on their perceived biases. Right. And they compared the Silver Bulletin, 538, Split Ticket, New York Times Siena, and VoteHub. And they looked at all those models, and they all have different methodologies. And so when people, like you and I always say, you can't look at any one poll and hold it to too high of a standard or too low of a standard. Just it's a data point to then there's the averages, but then the averages feed into the models. And so that's the level we're talking about, the models that try to control for what point in the cycle is it and which polls are getting included and what's their track record and accuracy. Turns out they're all very, very tightly grouped. In any given poll, they're really with any given model, they're within like a point to 2 points, really less. Many of them are like within 1 point when all things are factored in. So to a certain extent, whatever the corrections that these people have been making this cycle, they're all making similar or the net result of the adjustments that they've been making are leading us to the same place. So what that means is that we, again, polling is different than modeling, but when you look at the models, like we can pretty accurately trust that all the thoughtful people in the country that are putting these things together, they're all in alignment. So even if any given poll is skewed or any slightly, there's going to be ebb and flow, there's going to be news cycles, there's debates, there's just certain problems that come up, like the eating the cats and the dogs thing. Like as these things come and go, we have the closest election in modern history, and it's one of those things where the consequences are immense, so there are a significant portion of young people and a significant portion of people of color that aren't sure what they're going to do yet. And these are people that are probably going to vote a certain way, they claim, but it's not really clear. We're talking big numbers. We're talking 1 in 4, 1 in 5, and it's so there's a lot of electioneering left to happen, a lot of soul searching left to happen, and I think it's going to be one of the most interesting. We're policy wonks, we love this stuff, but I think that now that we're within 3 weeks or so, it's going to just continue to be one of the really interesting times.
Eeny, meeny, chili beany, the spirits are about to speak.
Are they friendly spirits?
Friendly? Just listen.
Well, that brings us to predictions. Dave, what do you have for us?
I'm going to stick to my typical practice these days of predicting on a topic that we covered in the prior segment, and I'm going to talk about the Texas senatorial race. Despite the fact that debate was contentious and engaging, and both of them really laid it all out on the table, and both sides made it crystal clear what people would be voting for. I think there's a unreasonable enthusiasm amongst Democrats here that Allred could possibly win. I know you've expressed it sometimes and said, hey, some polls show them within 1 point sometimes, and it could be the case, but I just think that all things being equal, Texas is a bridge too far for Democrats to think that they can pick up that state. The 5 to 7 points that Trump is ahead, and the 2 to 5 points that Cruz is ahead, that's going to be too much on election day to overcome. So I'm going to predict that, unfortunately, despite all the enthusiasm that people have shown for Allred being a better candidate in many ways, the dynamics of Texas are too entrenched, and Cruz will be successful again this time around.
Okay, we'll find out. I'm going to make 2 predictions here. One, I'm going to reverse myself in Maryland. I had thought that Larry Hogan was probably going to win this. I think he's very popular there, even with Democrats, very moderate, doesn't toe the Republican Party line, did a great job, apparently, as governor, challenged Trump during the pandemic, but this is the wrong election for him. If this was any other election, I would say he had a chance, but there are, I think, far too many Democrats as being revolved in the polls that just see this as they do not want the Senate to go to the Republicans based on their vote. So they are saying, sorry, while it's this close, I mean, if there were 55 one way or the other, they might bother. He is not going to get the the vote. So I am saying that Angela also Brooks is going to win that one. The polls seem to be bearing that out. Hogan's not getting anything moving towards him. Real quickly, I also want to go to the battleground congressional district, the second district of Nebraska and Omaha. The polls have been showing that Harris is out in front by upper single digits consistently. That is close, but it's been consistent. I'm wondering if there are Democrats and even maybe some Republicans there who are really angry at the Republicans for trying to take away their voice. But I am calling that for Harris. I think she will win that, and that is a big deal if she takes the 3 Rust Belt states and loses all the Sun Belt states, because that vote gets her to 270. We'll find out if any of this is true. In the meantime, stay informed and stay engaged.